What I hope to do now is to put a few questions to our panelists tonight to try to explore exactly what is Captagon, why there's been such an increase in its production, and who by and why, where's it been shipped to, not just Saudi Arabia, the other places, where might it get shipped to? I realise we're sitting in London, and in London it may seem far away, but actually there are doctors now in Harley Street who are treating people for addiction to Captagon. So this can change very, very fast. And also to look at, what is the impact, a little bit more deeper, on the end users? And also, what is the politics of all of this? Of course, we heard towards the end there about the Captagon produced in Syria. I think the British government maintained that 80% of Captagon is now produced in Syria. A question mark is about the value. They put the value at 57 billion, which I think might be queried in comparison to Caroline's figures in New Lines. And of course, what are the solutions? So I'm going to start with Caroline. Caroline Rose from New Line, who really is an expert and did an excellent report on this, because I just wanted to go into a little bit more detail about the origin of Abu Halayn. I mean, we hear that it was produced first of all in Germany, but how did it arrive in the Middle East, in Syria? Why did it start kicking off there?
Absolutely. Well, first off, I just want to say thank you so much to Arab News, not only for having me here, but also for this excellent documentary that really does fill a gap on Captagon as a whole, but then also how this dependency crisis is evolving and this law enforcement and security crisis is evolving inside of the kingdom. There was a lot of work that has been done about the trade overall, but really this was a gap that desperately needed to be filled. So thank you so much. And also, of course, thank you to the Frontline Club for having us. In terms of Captagon's kind of winding road, how did it end up in the Levant of all places after being produced in the mid-1960s by a pharmaceutical company called Degussa AG? They produced it primarily for attention deficit disorders, although there were some reports of Captagon being used for weight loss. The formula is phenethylene. It was produced in the 60s. At the time, it was one of the few that was for attention deficit issues. A boost in productivity was pretty much why people would take it. Then 1970s, 1980s roll around and you have Adderall and Ritalin and other alternatives that pop up on the market. On top of that, there are medical journal articles and research that are really showing that phenethylene is not as healthy as pharmacists thought it was originally, and it actually had a number of harmful effects to cardiovascular, pulmonary, and psychological health. So they schedule it in 1985 by the World Health Organization. It's phased out. That scheduling process took a very long time. And then you saw it move first to the Balkans, particularly in Bulgaria, where a series of kind of ex-Soviet factories look to elicit production for a bit. There, of course, are proven illicit and organized criminal networks that become heavily involved in Captagon production because they're used to producing it. It becomes a recreational party nightlife drug for a brief stint. Then there's a crackdown in the Balkans. It moves a bit into Turkey. And around that time, that's when Captagon started to become popular in the Gulf. That's where they started to carve out demand and markets in the Middle East, primarily in Saudi Arabia. And so they move it again to the Levant, primarily in Lebanon and a bit in Syria in the early 2000s. But at the time, it was very small scale. I mean, these were, individual figures looking to make Captagon very easily in their basements or, out in small warehouses or sheds. And it was extremely small. You would see seizures in the early 2000s and, with pills counting in the hundreds or sometimes thousands. It wasn't until the mid 2010s and late 2010s that we started to see the Captagon trade explode. Millions of pills, sometimes in one one go or multiple seizures in a day. Saudi Arabia would sometimes often have 4 seizures in a day at Al Haditha port. And that really was not common initially in the trade.
Now, Nadia Al-Four,
Yes.
who works for Arab News, you were in the program and you investigated this on the ground in Lebanon and in the KRG, I think, and spoke to those involved in the production. Why are these people getting into the production, the marketing of Captagon? What were they like?
So in Lebanon, as far as I was concerned, I kind of went out of my way to speak to dealers who weren't really necessarily protected by any minister or any party, let's just say that. And these were very poor people who were trying to feed their families because the economy in Lebanon has really taken maybe a deep dive, if you wish. The other kind of party who might be affiliated with some people, they kind of take it as some sort of a war on the minds of people. Because in their sense, if they try to weaken the minds of the Gulf, the youth, if they try to weaken the minds of the youth of the Gulf, they would be able to have like a, they would try to have some sort of an upper hand in terms of an ideological war. So you've got 2 hands. You've got the poor people who are trying to feed their families, and you've got the people who are very interested into the politics, who are trying to weaken the youth of the Gulf, who are doing it for their own military reasons, let's just say so.
It's more of a very political card to play for the dealers and the smugglers, or actually the people who are actually creating the pill, to have over certain regions in order to play out on this whole geopolitical conflict, if you will.
And you found evidence of ISIS having used this. It was known originally as a sort of jihadi drug. I mean, how did it move from, being a jihadi drug to becoming more mainstream within Syria, and now the regime is involved in Hezbollah?
I think it was always the case. Everybody was taking it. The people who affiliate with Hezbollah were taking it. The Syrian Arab Army was taking it. The Free Syrian Soldiers were taking it, and ISIS were taking it. And what's worse than that, having to hear traumatizing accounts from female Yazidi victims who were force-fed by ISIS to take these pills in order to withstand very long rape sessions and the torture sessions. So it's a mental war, and it was also a way for people to make money in a sense. But everybody and their mother was taking it in Syria, basically. Yeah, unfortunately.
Well, it's a drug that makes you feel invincible. Perhaps those in Wagner who are marching on Moscow were taking it. It is extraordinary. But Sਲման Al-Ansari, you're a leading Saudi commentator. I mean, how has Saudi officially reacted to this? We saw in the documentary, and people obviously have read, these huge seizures. I mean, very creative ways of trying to smuggle the drug into Saudi.
Right.
I mean, how are they going about? What's the strategy to try to stop this, or at least to dampen it down?
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris and Faisal, and to all the organizers of this amazing and important event. Let me just explain to you the magnitude of the problem, because right now anyone would be like, okay, they are speaking about a drug cartel. Every region in the world has a drug cartel of some sort, right? But let me explain to you the exact magnitude of this problem. It is huge. Can you please raise your hand if you have watched Pablo Escobar, the series of Netflix? Almost all of it. There you go. El Chapo. Okay, good. Any other drug-related series? Oh my God, okay. That's amazing. Okay, combine all these, according to a British study, a government statement and report, it says that the drug smuggling and the volume in cash that happened in Syria is equal 3 times the size of all the cartels in Latin America. You see the magnitude? So what's going on, and it's a new phenomena kind of. They've always been having this Kiptagon, etc., but they have never escalated it to this level. So that's why you are seeing this kind of big concerns, not only by the GCC countries and the Gulf. Also, the US had an act called the Kiptagon Act, even though the word Kiptagon is not even very familiar for Westerners. They're always like related to amphetamine, etc., right? So they started to have this act when? 2022, December. So just like a couple of months ago. Why? Because they were worried that it would go and touch the American soil. Why? Because a couple of months ago, Italy managed to stop $1 billion worth of Kiptagon in their ports. So you see the problem. And I remember actually the ex-director of CIA, David Petraeus, General David Petraeus, he said 9 years ago, like in the beginning of the issue in Syria, he said, what happens in Syria doesn't stay in Syria. Now I understand what he said. In every front. So in the beginning, we've been having the militias, the Iranian-backed militias. We've been having all these kind of jihadist groups, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, JFC. And right now, all of a sudden, we have a new challenge, which has something to do with drugs. So I think the Saudis have always been, as the documentary has been explaining, very strong and decisive with regards to drug smuggling. And we have, I can actually say it, we have almost the harshest punishments for that. And we are proud of that. Yes, indeed, some people would argue that the punishment is somehow not equal to the crime, because we have the death penalty for smugglers, specifically like for a specific kind of amount, etc. But at the same time, right now we are seeing this kind of increase in the smuggling process through the factories and the Iranian-backed militias, because here's the thing, Syria is the factory. And actually, like in Sueda, which is like a region like in the south, it is very close to Jordan. They didn't even want to bother themselves by having like a, an issue with the logistics. So they've put the factories themselves just by the borders of Jordan, so that they can just like ship it, So and 11 factories were actually like by the borders of Jordan. Jordan has been doing actually an amazing job, and it's a big challenge on them actually to confront these smugglers, etc. So they increased it. And they the Syrian regime, unfortunately, even though we had this kind of normalization, but as a Saudi independent political analyst, I would say, I kind of see that the Syrian regime is trying to use the drugs kind of issue as a bargaining kind of chip, or like a way through which you can blackmail the other Arab countries. And not only the Arab countries, but also the whole global community. Lift up the sanctions so we can actually be a normal nation. That's the kind of mentality they have. Maybe that's the kind of justification or moral justification that they are actually claiming to have, even though they have always voiced their rejection of the claims that they are actually producing that, which is ironic because everyone knows that. But I think the kingdom is right now, I don't remember, throughout the last 3 decades, I think the Saudis have never been as decisive historically as now, because the crisis is increasing day by day with regards to the Kiptagon issue, because it's a pandemic in itself. And the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crimes have said it clearly that 2 years ago, the number of addicts around the world are like around 296, so 300 million people. So imagine the size of the US population to be completely addict. So that's actually very alarming. So, and they said it very clearly in the first page of their report, the United Nations, DOC, they said it's the biggest enemy, but they said it in a different way, of the SDG goals, the sustainability development goals. So they know that it's a big issue. And one of the other things with regards to the amphetamine, people always think that weed is actually the thing that is predominant. Actually, amphetamine, like around the world, has more usage than the weed itself. Yes, I know that there are some Western countries that have no problems with weed, etc., and they are working on legalizing it, etc. But the thing with amphetamine and its danger, and also among women, 45% of the data were actually women were taking amphetamine. So it goes against SDG, it goes against the well-being of any community. Sorry, I'm taking a long time. I get carried away like that.
As the Saudi on the platform, I just wanted to ask you, in your experience, maybe you don't know the full answer to this, but which sort of Saudis or people living in Saudi Arabia taking the drug? We're talking, is it a drug of the youth? Is it in particular areas? I mean, who's, is it trendy? Is it something that people see as trendy?
Allow me to interrupt and say that that is actually a little teaser for our next documentary. So without giving it away too quickly,
He doesn't want to
wait for part 2 of our Abu Helaleen to answer that question.
But I would say, I'm going to answer. I don't care.
He's got to give a teaser. He's got to give a teaser. Come on.
I would say it's actually interesting because it all depends on the circle you surround yourself with. That's for sure. But I remember, like at the time when I used to be in school, like a long time ago, there's this idea of, oh, there's this pill, you take it like at the time of the exams. So that's the thing. Like we always attach the Keptagon to exams because this will make you awake. It's just like, as I've heard and seen, that one pill is equal to 10 shots of espresso. So it just makes you alert, you know? So the idea of, and then the schools in Saudi Arabia were always trying, like at the time of the exams, to tell the students and the young students, hey, yes, it's true that it makes you alert, but it doesn't make you to memorize the words that you are reading. And it's actually factual because there are studies about that. So it makes you, it gives you this fake kind of feeling that you are very awake and attentive, so you can actually do good in the exam. So I think it started from there. Unfortunately, with the young people who can actually be persuaded by their groups, and beside the fact it was considered to be a cheap kind of because as the documentary explained it, it's very easy to synthesize and to make, etc. But it wasn't like as alarming as it is right now. Why? Because as the documentary explained it, right now, the biggest drug cartel in the world is just next to us.
I want to add to that, sorry, to say that...
Tariq Ali Ahmed, I haven't probably
state one.
Tariq is really, this is all his brainchild, and he's running the documentary series for Arab News. Tariq.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to our panelists and to Nadia's courage on the ground. Nothing would have happened without Nadia's courage. And Faisal's guidance, of course.
Nadia.
Thank you.
But I wanted to say is that, this is a huge issue, not just because ISIS is taking it or kids are now taking it. It's become a drug of use for people who are working double shifts and need to stay awake. It's for people who have to drive across borders in order to ship certain items that we consume every single day. This is an issue because it's become so normalized within the community as a booster, which in a sense sheds light on the whole standard of living issue, which we're all being forced into going into hyperdrive and trying to help and fix things that are out of our control. So what do? We go towards drugs or pills or any kinds of amphetamines. Growing up, I was told Za'atar was how we get to memorize things.
All of us
We didn't get
know.
kept on. But
If that was the case, I'd be a genius.
but the reality of the fact is that it's coming through within our streets, within London, going to the US. You're going to find this pill growing and growing. We've seen the opioid epidemic happen in the US. And this was all under the nose of the government. Saudi Arabia and other countries are really trying to clamp down on this before it becomes its own opioid epidemic in the region or even in the world, which is at the rate it's going. We're seeing things really, as you said, as we saw in the documentary, like tables filled with Keptagon inside. Who knows what's going to come next?
Caroline, could I just come back to you? I mean, we've seen it go to Saudi Arabia. There've been all these hordes of the pills being caught in Italy, Greece, even Malaysia, I think recently. You know, how long really before it becomes a big problem in Europe if it continues without some sort of action?
Certainly. And I'll also add a few responses as well to some of the great comments. You know, there were a few years ago where I would have said, no, this is not going to Europe. This is going to be contained primarily in the Middle East. Keptagon would not be competitive in European markets. No, it's not going there. I am now kind of recalculating that assessment and reassessing the situation, looking at the data. I have a really big database of seizures and arrests, looking at the multiple directions in which Keptagon is growing, and it is trickling into Europe. I will say, though, that there is a bit of sensationalism, as with any illicit trade, about Keptagon. In the mid-2010s, when ISIS was primarily associated with it, everyone called it the jihadi pill or, you know, the terrorist drug. And because of that stereotype, there were initially a lot of incorrect assessments that unfortunately led policymakers and even media organizations to mischaracterize Keptagon. And because of that, I think that we've fallen behind the curve. So for example, the Port of Salerno seizure in July 1st, 2020, Italian authorities at the Port of Salerno in Naples seized at the time the largest amphetamine haul in history. And because there was that history with ISIS and everyone thought that this was exclusively an ISIS drug, even though it was sent and dispatched from the port of Latakia with extensive ties to the Syrian regime, everyone kind of missed that initially and thought that this was ISIS. Even the Italian authorities said that, oh, ISIS shipped this, even though they didn't have access to the port, even though ISIS wouldn't be able to accomplish producing that much Keptagon, let alone shipping that much Keptagon, and the fact that they didn't have ties with the Italian mafia group, the Camorra. So there, because of these stereotypes, we're kind of missing, we're you know, seeing the forest for the trees. I forget how that saying goes, but we have to be really, really vigilant. Because of that, I would say the numbers game that we're falling into is also a dangerous one. Assessing the value of Keptagon, assessing how much actors are reaping from the trade, and most importantly, assessing the value of the trade. And we've seen some crazy numbers lately. I understand that the UK government, along with a number of media organizations, have assessed that Keptagon is worth 58 billion. In my opinion, no. Keptagon is lucrative. It is geopolitically important in a malign way. It is a very, it has a degrading effect on law enforcement, rule of law, security, but they're not making more than the cocaine trade is for Mexican cartels. There's no way. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't dismiss how much these actors, such as the Syrian regime, Hezbollah, IRGC-aligned militias, are making from the trade. Recently, there was an excellent report that the FCDO actually funded, conducted by the Observatory for Political and Economic Networks, that assessed that the Syrian regime, the top actors, this isn't the entirety of this network, but just the top actors alone were making $7 billion in the last 3 years. That's significant. There was also an excellent study conducted by AFP that said that a conservative estimate of both seized and unseized Keptagon, both what's being caught by law enforcement and also the pills that are trickling through, that's 10 billion, and that's still around an 80% estimate of what Keptagon could be. So we shouldn't, dismiss that weight. It's extremely important. I kind of forget the question that you asked initially. I'm so sorry.
Don't worry. I wanted actually to shift into the politics, and Syria was mentioned, where that British government report said 80% of Keptagon is now being produced. And this is fascinating in the sense that here is a country that has been wrecked. It's possibly either the first or the second largest form of hard currency receipts for the regime. So perhaps for Tarek or Salman, Nadia, I mean, feel free to contribute to this. But when Syria gets invited back into the Arab League, I suppose the question is this deal going to work? Will the Syrian regime be able to sort of tamp down on this trade? And I mean, or are you dealing with, actually you've made a deal as the Arab League with essentially a narco state, a drugs regime in which, leading members of the regime are involved. And many of you may have seen that the Syrian authorities have now, taken action against, BBC journalists for having reported on this. Will Syria be the solution to this?
Say something?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so I know that there are a lot of misunderstandings with regards to what does it really mean to have Syria to be back to the Arab fold. And the best who can explain it is the Foreign Affairs Minister of Saudi Arabia, Prince Faisal bin Farhan, who said it's only a deal to have a step for a step. So we admitted them to the Arab bloc, and we need to see steps from their side so we can take further steps. So it's nothing going to be for free. The idea that whereas, like the information that was circulated that Saudi Arabia will help on the rebuilding, will help with things, etc., I don't think that's actually accurate. Why? Because the things, and here's the thing, because one of the concerns that was there was coming from the US with regard to the whole thing, the normalization between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and what does it mean to the region, etc., because it came through the Chinese. But the thing with regards to Syria, I think the Saudis and the Americans are exactly on the same page. Why I'm saying so? Because if we go back to the Congress bill, the Caesar bill, which says, okay, the sanctions will be lifted the moment you do these three things. One, to have the 2254 United Nations Accord to be applied, which is some form of like a political reform. It didn't say explicitly that Bashar needs to go. So there can be some kind of reforms, even though I'm not actually very optimistic with the current Syrian regime, like in the way they see the whole thing. The second demand from the Congress bill, which is actually something Saudi Arabia would love to see, because Saudi Arabia is part of the United Nations and they actually supported the 2254 completely. The second demand is to have some sort of an amnesty for the opposition and to have them back, which is somehow related to the first point as well. The third, which is to kick out the Iranian militias or the foreign militias. Saudi Arabia definitely wants that. And also with regards to the immigration, because right now there are like around 1.5 million Syrian refugees just in Lebanon. So imagine Lebanon. So it's like for every 4 Lebanese citizens, there is 1 Syrian refugee. And Lebanon, with its current economy, it's already a collapsed kind of economy. So imagine the kind of benefits we will do to the neighboring countries the moment we can manage to get the refugees back to Syria. The same goes with Jordan, 1.2 million refugees, etc. The same goes with Turkey and so many different countries. And Egypt as well, they have 500,000 Syrian refugees. Saudi Arabia wants all these demands that have been asked by the Americans from the Syrian regime. But we have a different tactic. Okay, the Americans were having this kind of isolationist kind of tactic, which is we are not going to talk to the Syrian regime at all. No engagement, zero engagement. And the Saudis were like, we can actually see how we can further the interest of the whole region and our bilateral interest through engagement. Does that mean we are okay with them being a narco state? Not at all, because we actually added that provision, which is to crack down on the drug smuggling, etc. And just a couple of days before Bashar visited Saudi Arabia and before he got admitted into the Arab bloc, the foreign affairs ministers of 4 countries, I believe, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Syria, have all met in Amman. And the main thing that they mentioned was the crackdown on drug smuggling, etc. And the Syrians promised that they would do so. Will they? I don't know, but it's going to be a long process.
We shall see. Let's open up to audience questions, and Tarek or Faisal will shout at me if we're running out of time. Right, let's have a gentleman here, and then a lady there. If you could say who you are, sir, and any affiliation you have.
Mike.
I've understood in the past that one of the major controllers of all international drug trade is the Russian mafia. And is the Russian mafia behind all this? Their distribution powers, particularly through Rotterdam, has been extensive historically.
Wonderful. I think I'm going to leave that to Nadi.
Sorry, which
The Syria
affiliation?
Time in
expert.
war zones.
Historically speaking, I cannot really comment, but what I can tell you, Syria being kind of a puppet state to Russia, I can imagine that the Russian mobsters are giving protections for the smugglers to smuggle into Europe. I mean, that's kind of a given. Actually, they wouldn't make it this far without Russian protection. I highly doubt it. Yeah.
I would also add that I think Russia has a vested interest in the Syrian regime earning hard currency to pay off a lot of debts. The lady at the end there, if you could say who you are.
Yeah, my name is Hind, and I wanted to ask Nadia. So you mentioned that the Yazidi women, they were raped by
ISIS.
Yeah, by
Yeah.
ISIS. Did you meet any of the victims?
I did. I actually met them in 2019 before I began working for Arab News, and I met them recently. And I met them when we were working on the documentary, but some refused to go on record because it's a very taboo subject. And some of the children, they're not really accepted into Yazidi society. So, but unfortunately, yeah, they were force-fed Captagon pills in order for them to remain awake for 24 hours, 48 hours. It's quite horrific. Yeah.
Any sense of how widespread that was? Or?
I mean, I think it was pretty widespread because they were horrifically sexually enslaved, and Captagon was very rampant within the soldiers, whether they were fighting or whether they wanted to torture people. It was really rather rampant. Yeah.
Gentleman here, if you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you all very much. Extremely interesting. I took a lot of notes. The name's Ewan Grant. I'm a former UK law enforcement intelligence analyst covering the ex-Soviet states. I've worked in Yemen. I've worked in Amman, Aqaba, the border, Jordan border with Saudi, and the northern border with Syria. On Mutiny Saturday a few weeks ago, I gave 4 interviews on television, and in the downtime in the studio, I urged people to look at this issue and look west, look a long way west. This is brilliant stuff. Absolutely. You should copyright what you just said and get it to a wide audience. My question for all of you is, who is listening to you? Because an awful lot of people need to. This is 21st century. And although they're using 21st century technology to combat this, it's a 20th century mindset. So who's listening?
I'll take that. Actually, I'll start with that.
We'll take another question and we'll come back to the panelists. There's a gentleman over here. Just introduce yourself.
Hey, hi. I'm Paul Kenyon. I'm from BBC Panorama. I'm a correspondent. I really enjoyed your film. It was great. I was interested, just as a filmmaker, about whether or not you felt you got a lot of cooperation there from the Saudi authorities and some access there, or did you feel as though this was something they would see as potential reputational damage and therefore they weren't that excited about getting involved? So it's about a filmmaking issue rather than the actual subject matter.
So first of all, thank you very much for your question, Ewan. Who is listening? Well, the fact that we're in London right now at the Frontline Club, one of the most leading established journalistic members clubs in the world, talking to you all here, coming from all different backgrounds, is a testament to how serious we are about making sure that people are listening. It's our jobs as journalists. We're serious about people, definitely. Now, as is the case, but when you see people, journalists from the BBC in Syria being withdrawn permits for doing their job in Syria by the Syrian government, you see people are starting to listen more and more about these things. We're here coming from the Arab world, telling people to look in. It's not the Western world looking in to itself. We're here giving you, this is the product, this is what's going on, this is what's on the ground, this is what needs to be shed a light on before it gets too late. So that is essentially my take on that. Definitely, we really are all in this on this together. because you see stories that Nadia's seen on the ground, and these unfortunately, heartbreakingly are turned over with the next rapid news story against what's happening at the BBC right now. But all the time, these stories are getting hidden, and just this is why we keep pursuing and persisting. And the fact that this, for example, we're saying this happened to a Yazidi woman. What if it happened to an American woman, a British woman, a European woman, whatnot? Now, with regard to the film issues, on the contrary, the Saudi authorities really want to showcase what they're doing. This is the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been very serious about the whole clampdown on Kebtagon. As you've seen, we have rushes of Saudi border patrol opening up full shipments, dogs sniffing everything. They're keen to showcase that they're serious about this. And this is not a stunt. This is literally what's happening on the ground in borders within the city, within the country. So there were no filming issues. Does anyone else want?
I would just add a little bit on, are people in the West taking notice of this? My job, I do a lot of work with politicians. I'm very conscious when talking to Arabs, they know exactly what Kebtagon is. When talking to politicians here, I would say at the moment, they don't. It's not totally a disinterest, it's just there's so much else going on, Ukraine and everything else, that they haven't really, the issue of Kebtagon hasn't sunk in here yet. That would be just an anecdotal reflection.
Just very quickly regarding who's listening, I will say that with this week's news of the accreditation being revoked from this BBC documentary, it's very clear the Syrian regime is listening. And the fact that, from my understanding, this is the first time that accreditation has been revoked over a BBC investigation, and this is throughout the Civil War. I mean, the BBC has done excellent work, along with other news organizations, on mass atrocities, war crimes, use of chemical weapons, etc., etc., etc. And this is the straw that breaks the camel's back. That shows you how important this trade is for revenue, alternative financial streams. And for that alone, that should be not the selling point, but why we should really take this issue seriously. And while I think that there isn't public understanding of Kebtagon because it's still a niche subject, I do applaud both the United States, UK, the EU, as well as other regional governments for not only prioritizing interdiction in the last 2 to 3 years, but then also we've seen the Kebtagon Act, we've seen the UK impose sanctions jointly with the United States, with the EU following shortly after on a number of Kebtagon kingpins. We're starting to see a strategy emerge in Washington on this. It's taken a little too long, but there is movement and momentum. And because of that, I think that that's been very positive.
Indeed. I think we've got time for a few more questions.
Okay.
Becky, and then...
I'm really, thank you. And this is so fascinating. And Faisal, and to all of you who've put this documentary together, it's brilliant. Well done. So I'm just really fascinated to get your perspective on the carrot and stick here, because the carrot is Bashar al-Assad is back in from the cold. What's the quid pro quo at this point? Apart from being back in from the cold, we know, and I've spoken to Jordanian foreign minister about this, and foreign ministers around the region. what do you understand they need to see as evidence that the Syrian regime is getting on with this? We know, I don't think the Jordanians ever stood this up, but the Jordanians attacked that kingpin very soon after. I did an interview with the Jordanian foreign minister, and very soon after Bashar al-Assad was at the meeting in Syria, in Saudi. So where's the stick here from the GCC? You've just talked about what the West is doing, and I actually think there is some good work being done both in the US here, in the UK and elsewhere. But from the GCC and other Arab nations, what's the stick?
Yeah, you gonna say something?
Just take another.
Sure.
Gentleman behind you.
Can I say something?
I'm Mohammed from Egypt, so
Ahlan
we're facing the danger of this is coming soon. I have a couple of questions. First of all, I'm quite interested in the dynamic that makes the Syrian regime sell the pill to the people who are fighting against them, like in ISIS, and it's quite interesting. The second part, does the West need to look at the way they do sanctions? Because in the Middle East, and Iran, Syria, Libya and stuff, the way sanctions have worked so far over the past couple of decades is basically create terrorist states, narco states, and so on. There should be a better way.
Okay, who wants to take
Okay.
the question?
Yeah. Thank you, Becky. And just a side note, my first TV interview was 10 years ago with Becky Anderson. So it's very interesting. So as I said earlier, there's no such thing. There's no a magic kind of stick that can actually, or a silver bullet, as you call it, for the whole issue with Syria. We have to understand that there is no, okay, it sounds like hyperbolic, but seriously, there is no Syria. We are speaking of a country that is divided into 5 pieces. A piece with the Turks in the northwestern part, a piece with the Americans in the northeastern part, a chunk with the Kurds, a chunk with somehow with the Russians, even though on the coast, and some other militias, Iranian corridor from Iran, Iraq, Syria to Lebanon. So in theory, there is Syria, but in practice, there isn't. So what is the best way? Is it to just isolate them? That's the kind of Saudi kind of idea. Is it completely to isolate them and to do what we have been doing? And as they say, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always gotten. So we want to just move away and do something new. Let's have some sort of engagement. But that doesn't mean in any way, shape or form that we are gonna let down the opposition, which has been approved by the United Nations under the 2254. So we were like holding the stick from the front from the very beginning. Right now, we are somehow holding it from the middle. We are having the communication with both the opposition and just like the Russians themselves, the biggest ally of Syria, is having communication with the opposition itself, with the Syrian opposition. So being with Syria doesn't mean that you cannot play with all the cards that you have to find a solution. So definitely Saudi Arabia and the GCC would need to do that. We'd need to be engaged more with all the stakeholders when it comes to Syria, because it's a very sad story. With regards to the drugs, yes, there have been some verbal commitments by the Foreign Affairs Minister of Syria. Will we take it at face value? I don't know how we should perceive it, but definitely actions speak louder than words. So we are trying to see what kind of measurement that will be taken by the Syrian regime, because everyone is suffering. Jordan is suffering, the GCC is suffering. Everyone in the Arab world is actually, Europe is suffering as well from the Keptagon as well. So definitely it will be at the interest of the whole region to have real engagement with what is left in Syria, okay, to crack down on this pandemic, I would call it. And so,
Tariq,
yeah.
I just wanted to come to you on this. Just a reminder that within the Syrian regime, the reports accuse the president's brother, Maher al-Assad. We have his Mohammed Shalish. We've got others who are absolute kingpins of this regime. accused of being party to this trade. So is it naive to imagine, that they are going to give up this lucrative trade? I mean, it does come to Becky Anderson's point here, surely. Will they, what really is going to be the inducement for this regime to give up such a huge money earner? And can we trust them?
Well, time will tell is my genuine answer with this. You have brought in Bashar al-Assad's regime to the table. We've seen right after the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi, we saw the kingpin, as we saw in the documentary, the kingpin being killed, and that was no surprise. And as we said, this whole continuous an uptick in seizures from the government coming out of Syria is showcasing that Syria is willing to talk, but at the same time, I cannot really say anything that I'm not sure of completely. And time will tell. We'll see if they will take the carrot, if they'll take the stick and use it to hit.
Caroline, you wanted to come in, and then Nadia.
Okay, I think time will tell, and I hope something positive will happen, but I don't really think they call the shots. That's for one. And for two, what I was trying to explain when I first began talking, and then I was a little bit anxious, so excuse me for that. What I was trying to say is that maybe diplomatically speaking, they may have reopened ties between Iran, between Syria and all of that, but on the ground, the smugglers who are being backed by, let's just call it out there, by the Syrian regime or by Hezbollah, they have a very nefarious motive where they want to continue doing this in order to weaken the GCC society, because the more they are weakened, the more that they have power. So I honestly don't believe anything will change. And they're making so much money out of this.
Caroline, you wanted to come in.
I couldn't agree more with Nadia on this. I understand the perspective of the GCC in that whatever has been tried, this punitive isolation tactic, it's uncomfortable because we haven't necessarily seen immediate results. It's uncomfortable for regional neighbors. And so they're trying to do this to shake things up. But by putting anti-narcotics as the top agenda item and thinking that the regime would build momentum that would then bleed into a political settlement under 2254, the repatriation of refugees, et cetera, you're not going to see it. And if you look at articles from Sana, if you do a kind of a run through and you look at the statistics, the regime, because it has control over media organizations, it has control over its anti-narcotics directorate, it has control over a number of these checkpoints, they feed you the data. They get to say, oh, we had a 50% uptick in seizures and arrests. Excellent, we can move on now. Can you give us another concession? Can you lift sanctions? They control all of that. So I think it's very important that if you are going to put counter-narcotics collaboration, as for example, Jordan, Iraq did at the summit in Amman, have conditions and hold them accountable. Do your due diligence, look through the data points, look through the information that they're providing you. Otherwise, we're just taking what they're providing.
Does it need independent monitoring on the ground?
Absolutely it does. Absolutely it does. And what it needs is greater regional collaboration that does not involve the Syrian regime from the beginning.
How can we involve the UN?
The UN?
The UN Office of Drugs and Crimes.
The UNODC is certainly, I think that they've been tracking this, as has Interpol.
Is there like a mechanism through which we have like
not specifically on Captagon.
Okay.
And you also have now.
So that's an opportunity we can actually activate somehow.
You also have Secretary Anthony Blinken just launched a global coalition to combat synthetic substances. But what are the other substances in there? Methamphetamine, fentanyl. That overshadows Captagon completely. Captagon's included, but it's fentanyl. So that's going to get overshadowed. There needs to be a specific Captagon focused task force, mechanism, framework, whatever you call it, that has the trusted partners first, cultivates a conversation, shares information, holds actors accountable. So when you get fed information from Damascus, you can call them out on the lies and misinformation that they're putting through. And you can see they're extremely serious about this trade. Really, this is a major alternative revenue stream for them. They have the production facilities, they have the system, as Nadia mentioned, they have a whole network. Also building in space for plausible deniability. They employ a lot of people. It's a source of legitimacy and credibility for them. So it's going to take a lot of work and monitoring and data collection to resolve this.
I don't think we quite answered your question on sanctions. So just to say, I think that's probably entering into a great big wide conversation, which I personally find fascinating in terms of whether sanctions regime work, after what time, how do you adapt? But I'd happily chat with you after that. But you're right to say that sanctions regimes don't have a particularly great record in delivering the results that those people who impose the sanctions actually want. The sanctions haven't changed the behavior of the Syrian regime any more than it did Saddam Hussein or Fidel Castro or Hamas in Gaza. I think Faisal, you wanted to.
I'm going to get the closing remarks.
But sorry, you're right. So you got a question there and a question there. Okay, so.
Thank you very much for this fascinating documentary. This is Zuhair. My question is rather non-political. Everyone, we've been speaking about the spread and the widespread of this drug, and the political ties of the Assad regime and Hezbollah and blah, blah, blah. But we haven't spoken much about how it's kind of affecting the communities and how it's being dealt with throughout the research and the making of this documentary. Like, have you sensed in Syria and the neighboring countries such as Lebanon and Jordan, where refugees are in millions, let alone Saudi Arabia, have you seen that there is a countering campaigns and counter efforts that match the scale of the efforts to kind of spread
Thanks,
the drugs? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do you want to take another question?
Second question here. Come to you on that one.
My name's Tamara. I was wondering, because Captagon is so easy and cheap to produce, why is it that we're seeing distributors and dealers from certain countries choosing to deal with Syria rather than to make it, locally at home? When you see seizures that result in billions of pills going down the drain, doesn't it make sense more logistically to produce it locally?
Questions, Tariq. Let's start with you.
Sure. So with Zuhair, thank you for your question. Again, this is a teaser for our next documentary on the communities themselves and the users. But to give you like a small glimpse, in Lebanon, as you know, there's a huge financial and economic crisis that inflation is through the roof, and products on the ground, including drugs such as cocaine and any kind of MDMA and whatnot, are through the roof, and people cannot now afford this kind of lucrative drug to use in their nightlife and whatnot. So when they get something that's called Captagon, which is dubbed the poor man's cocaine, which costs 1/10 of what a bag of cocaine would cost, that's how it would spread throughout the community. So this is tackling people who are looking for different alternatives in order to get that same high. So if someone came up to someone and goes like, okay, this is one pill that can give you, it's like cocaine for like the whole day, they're gonna take it instead of going through the others.
Caroline, could I just come onto one issue here about the use of the drug in Syria, because there seems to be different qualities of the drug, and indeed, I think I saw you commenting once on, we're not even sure now what's in many batches of Captagon and the variants. So could you take us a little bit through the different types of Captagon that might be found?
Sure, and I think Nadia also might have some comments on this. We were just talking about this right before, the different variants. This is one of probably the biggest problems with Captagon, is that we can't really clearly define it anymore. phenethylene from the 1960s. Then it was scheduled, and then starting off in the mid 2000s, the very few laboratory analyses that have been conducted on Captagon, that were a few of them that were done in Jordan in 2005 or 2006, I can't remember correctly, but that's when they started to see that it didn't resemble the phenethylene formula at all. So starting off in the mid 2000s, producers essentially made Captagon as they wanted to. You put on the 2 crescent moons and you call it Captagon, and then voila, you have Captagon. And because of that, again, there are very few laboratory analyses that are conducted. You see Captagon with sometimes no amphetamine at all, sometimes amphetamine that is up to 47% metabolized inside of a pill, and then a mishmash of additives, caffeine, quinine, pseudoephedrine, a number of different precursors, and just whatever they want to put in, because it's really whatever you make of it. And because it's so easy to do, it's not crop based, you essentially have producers finding whatever is available. And people have different preferences. There are different street names. You're starting to see a variety of different colors. I think that this documentary showed a few images where you've got some white pills, but you also have really disgusting, mealy looking yellow or brown pills that if you were in a nightclub, I don't know why you would ever want to take that. I feel like the white pills look much safer than the mealy brown, red, and yellow pills. And for a reason, they're considered more pure. They have a pure concentration of amphetamine. And I mean, in the last year, as someone who's looking at all these seizures, you're starting to see all of the colors of the rainbow pop up in, these different ports around the region. And that's extremely concerning. We have no way to know what they reflect because no one's doing laboratory analyses and publishing them.
Yeah, Tamara, was that like a response to your question? Because I feel like she wanted to ask about okay, it's easy to make, but if you want to do mass production, you definitely have to have a state umbrella, because you'll be very vulnerable. So that's the thing. So when it was outlawed in Germany in the 80s, it went to Bulgaria and Turkey, and some gangs there and mafias were trying to make this, and they were like spreading it all over. And then who took over afterward? Syria. So that's why 80% of the global production of Captagon happens in Syria, and Hezbollah is the one that actually does the logistics. And
I might also say that in some of the European countries, some drugs are legal. So why would they make disgusting drugs if you have other drugs that can kind of compensate and give you the same high, whether you need to work or you need to party? So it wouldn't make sense for European countries or maybe other states to actually produce it locally. Yeah, no.
And of course, there's a whole history of failed and failing states and conflict states who've been involved in narcotics. I would just, before I call on Faisal to say a few closing remarks, I just want to thank the panelists for a great discussion and for all the wonderful questions from you, the audience. It's been a great pleasure. I hope you've enjoyed it as well. But to wind up, once again, Faisal Abbas, the editor-in-chief of Arab News.
Thank you very much, Chris and the panelists. Actually, I was going to announce Abu Halaleen too, but thank you, Tariq, for stealing my thunder. So we'll talk about this later. So I was going to say, hopefully this is the beginning, and Arab News is now going to seriously consider doing documentaries. I think by the turnout, and we can go on not just because of the documentary, but because of the great panel and the moderator that we have. I think there's genuine interest in such topics, and we hope to continue to shed light on the matters that, again, we live in an interconnected world. We are in a kingdom here that is very different than my home country of Saudi Arabia, but we can see how there are things that, despite our differences, we can still work on for the greater good and for the good of humanity as a whole, despite the things that set us apart. Again, Tariq stole my thunder, so I don't have an announcement to do, but I do want to thank, I'll start with Caroline. Actually, I'm not going to thank you. I'm going to make a wish. I hope that you join the government one day, because you just restored
I
our
support
hope.
that.
You just restored our hope in America, and if everybody is as passionate about the topics and knowledgeable about the topics as you do, we'll be in a very good place. So I do hope you see spearheading an effort to seriously take down these mafias. Salman, thank you very much for being with us on the panel. Not just on this panel, thank you for talking on behalf of Saudi Arabia, explaining what has happening in Saudi Arabia in the toughest of times and at the times where nobody else was doing it. I'm very proud to call you a friend. Tariq will talk later about stealing my thunder, but well done on an amazing documentary. Took a year and a half. We had our differences of point of view, to put it subtly, but just judging by the turnout tonight and the questions and the debate, I can't thank you enough for your doing. Nadia, you don't have to apologize for anything. For somebody to be as brave as you, go undercover, sit with these not so nice people, put your life at risk. Actually, Nadia literally begged me not to be on stage. Her words literally were like, I don't mind you sending me to the Taliban or sending me to Al-Qaeda, but just don't put me to talk in front of people. So I think you did amazing well, and thank you very much for your courage. Last but not least, our moderator, Chris, thank you for doing this. Thank you for taking on this cause, and thank you for taking on all the just causes that you, and the amazing work that you do at CAABU. Despite it not being popular, you still stick to the right cause. You get very little gratitude for that. So at least from us here at Arab News and from everybody, thank you for all the work that you do. Thank you. If anybody would like to speak to any of the panelists or the filmmakers or the experts, we're going to be downstairs in the members area, and I hope you enjoyed your evening. Thank you very much.